Situated in a seemingly remote northwestern corner of Europe, Glasgow was an unlikely holder of the title of Second City of the Empire. So how did a small cathedral city on the banks of the River Clyde develop a stunning cityscape unlike anything else in Britain, and grow to become one of the great industrial, cultural and architectural wonders of the modern world?
People love Glasgow. If you take a cross-section of people off the streets of Glasgow of different classes, they will all agree that they love the city, even though it's got its imperfections. They love it.
There was a really special moment here from kind of the Georgian era onwards, right up to the Second World War, where it's absolutely everything just comes together so well. You've got all the technological advances, you've got all the various different phases of architecture that are all across the city. It all works together into this kind of seamless whole.
Glasgow was such a cutting-edge city at the time. The range of public parks that were on offer, the public buildings that were being erected, and the extent to which they were available free of charge to people of the city, and the quality of architecture was constantly changing.
Glasgow is a city people love to live in. Set along the banks of the River Clyde on the west coast of Scotland, the city is currently home to over 500,000 people. Renowned for its friendliness, Glasgow has a global reputation as a nurturing artistic and cultural centre, as well as a history of industrial excellence. Given its past reputation as a centre of heavy industry, the fabric of the city itself can come as a surprise to visitors. The townscape of Glasgow embraces its natural landscape, distinguished by lush green parks, spectacular civic buildings, and streets lined with majestic tenements. But how did Glasgow become this magnificent place, with architecture that stands alongside some of the greatest achievements in Europe? For the vast majority of its early history, Glasgow was a small medieval town, dominated by its cathedral. The city was inextricably linked with the Clyde, slowly expanding south from the religious centre to the banks of the river. The town grew as a result of trade, particularly in what is now known as the Merchant City, built in one of the few flat areas available. When the 1707 Act of Union was passed, creating one kingdom of Scotland and England, Scotland gained access to England's global colonial markets. Glasgow's position on the west coast of Scotland meant the passage across the North Atlantic was a good 3 weeks faster than from other UK ports. With the taste for tobacco increasing and the French government permitting Glasgow a monopoly over all French tobacco imports, Glasgow rapidly benefited from the trade, which stimulated the growth of manufacturing industries. The Industrial Revolution, spurred in part by the engineering innovations of Glasgow's own James Watt, was also key to this increase in wealth. Indeed, Glasgow and the other Clyde towns made much of the world's shipping and railway equipment that encouraged global trading to develop. A side effect of the massive expansion in industry and wealth that made Glasgow the second city of the British Empire is that almost none of the medieval town that Glasgow once was now remains. It was replaced in the 18th and 19th centuries by a modern city in a style unlike anything else found in Britain. The topography of Glasgow is fundamental to this unique character. The landscape is dominated by small hills called drumlins, formed by glacial ice and shaped like the inverted half of an egg.
What architects in the 1850s, the mid-19th century, had was a tremendous opportunity to actually master plan because land in very large parts of the city was undeveloped. So they were given the opportunity to control the manner in which the streets related to one another, how they responded to contours, where a little pocket park might be created, what height the buildings were in relation to one another, what might happen in the kind of the back lane areas. They had a clean slate. Now, for the most part, they responded in grid form, because Glasgow is, of course, a city that follows a grid form, which makes it such a tremendous city to walk around, because you've got tremendous potential for vistas and views.
Glasgow typifies dealing with a topography and applying a kind of framework for how to actually deal with topography. You have these drumlins that have a grid that runs over them, and it's amazing when you can actually see the kind of grain of the city as you walk through.
The great merit of a fairly straightforward grid pattern is that your vistas are always there. And one of the finest views in Glasgow, I think, is the view looking to the west from about the Kelvin Bridge and seeing the Kilpatrick Hills away in the distance. I mean, it's beautiful. You're never forced to think about the inwardnesses of Glasgow. But you see the hills as, if you like, distant things, not things affecting you on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sure there are lots and lots and lots of Glaswegians who've never been anywhere near the Kilpatricks or the Campsies or the Renfrewshire Heights, but they're still there, they're still part of what they appreciate about the city.
What's nice about Glasgow is firstly the stone. The stone has a real warmth to it. It's also the kind of the subtlety and the understated of the classical detailing of the city. And it's also the kind of the harmoniousness of it, the fact that it hangs all together. The way that those streets are structured gives it a real big city feel. So particularly when you get to streets like St. Vincent Street, and when you walk down St. Vincent Street to the east through the centre of the town, you get this kind of great canyon effect, and you can see all these kind of the grid of streets all crossing each other, and it just feels so American in flavour.
The newly developing town centre, north of the Trongate and west of the High Street, became the central commercial area of Glasgow. Streets running east to west, parallel to the Clyde, were widest to take traffic of goods. The north-south streets were narrower and contained the counting houses, warehouses and offices that were the heart of the city's trade. This distinctive grid layout was exploited by one of Scotland's most influential architects, Alexander Greek Thomson. Thompson created an architectural language designed to work in harmony with the grid, and which would embrace many different building types. Tenement and terrace blocks were built that reinforced the grid and were punctuated by civic buildings, such as churches. The grid didn't inhibit individuality, but there is a sense of unity in proportion, height, and materials.
I'm fascinated by Thompson because he's somebody out on a limb. I think only Glasgow could have produced him. He was a man of extraordinary originality in his own terms, and somebody who was both a rather hard-nosed commercial architect doing villas and terraces and houses and commercial buildings, but also a sort of dreamy mystic, dreaming about the ancient world, about Egypt and Greece, about eternal laws and things like that he would go on about in his lectures. So he's a strange combination, and I think one of the most remarkable architects of the 19th century.
The Greek Revival was an architectural movement that grew to prominence in the late 18th century. It had its roots in the achievements of Scottish Enlightenment writers such as David Hume, Robert Burns and Adam Smith, and was manifested in the Edinburgh New Town, in Edinburgh's aspiration to be an Athens of the North. Architects were inspired by the publication of books with incredibly detailed illustrations of buildings in the ancient world, not only Greek, but Egyptian and Moorish, images and ideas that had not been accessible before.
The Greek Revival was fashionable all over Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century, once the exact nature of the antiquities of Greece were known. But Thompson wasn't really an archaeologist. He took up his own Greek style at a time when it was out of fashion in England and going out of fashion in Scotland. And he interpreted those Greek precedents with extraordinary originality, doing strange things, combining them with new materials, vast sheets of plate glass, cast iron structures, and things like that. There was nobody quite like him. I think Thompson's view of architecture was very much founded on his religious faith. His eternal laws were almost like biblical laws, things that were immutable. In terms of architecture, they were to do with the use of stone and solid structures and coping with gravity, hence his fascination with, obsession with almost what he called trabeated construction, columns upright supporting lintels. He's such a mixture of the practical and the dreamy, which is part of, I think, the fascination of the man. And I think he was strongly influenced, it's always been suggested, by the paintings of John Martin, that extraordinary apocalyptic mystical painter of the 1820s, 30s and 40s, things like The Fall of Nineveh and Belshazzar's Feast, where terrible things are happening in the foreground with Old Testament figures, and in the background, colonnades retreating towards infinity. That's what I think Thompson was trying to achieve in the streets of Glasgow. Thompson had this desire, I think, always to see masonry supporting his columns were doing a job, walls were doing a job, windows let in light, but he didn't want to draw attention to the window itself. And so here, as in a few other buildings, he took the biggest sheets of glass he could get, which was rolled glass from Lancashire, and rammed it straight into the masonry. There are no frames. So the window is just a void, lets in light, but from the outside, he doesn't want your attention to be drawn to the window, but to the surrounding wall or the column, and that's what you have here. And so it's an extraordinary effect, especially up in the clerestory, these huge sheets of slightly wobbly glass. Of course, they're a nightmare to replace if they get broken. One reason why Thompson was so successful, of course, he was designing at a time when the city was expanding, when there was a great demand for houses, for villas to surround the city, as well as for new commercial buildings. He did a number of partly iron-framed office blocks, one would call them now, in the city centre. He also, of course, did some rather wonderful grave monuments, which you find in the necropolis. So all the things that Glaswegians needed, whether for living, sleeping, working, and when they were dead, Thompson could supply. In the late 1860s, a number of architects were invited to advise on the Glasgow Improvement Scheme, which of course was slum clearance scheme in the High Street, and also laying out new streets in Hutchison Town and the Gorbals, with which Thompson was involved. But a particular project of his was to propose streets of tenements quite wide, with covered by glass and I presume iron roofs, in which children could play and also produce a good, healthy climate. He was particularly interested in that, and of course he was very much concerned because he'd lost a number of his own children to cholera and other diseases in the mid-century.
In the mid-19th century, Glasgow's population was exploding, with 1,000 people a week arriving from Ireland alone. Many were housed around the ancient Cross of Glasgow, with its myriad of densely packed closes and wynds. These conditions, famously recorded by the groundbreaking Scottish photographer Thomas Annan, led to outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. At the same time, there was a desire to build better class housing in the south and west of the city, where the prevailing winds would reduce the effects of pollution.
All the plagues and these kind of great epidemics that were happening were all caused by the foul air in Glasgow. This is mid-Victorian thinking, that this was the miasmas that they needed to sweep away with sunlight and fresh air and with wind. And so that's one of the reasons why you got things like the City Improvement Trust happening in Glasgow, because they were trying to open up great wide streets in the centre of the city to do that. And there was also a whole area of Glasgow which was next door to what was then Glasgow University on the High Street, which was an absolute warren. When you look at it on the Ordnance Survey maps of the city, you think, how on earth the police could have policed an area like that, because it was just a maze.
Alexander Greek Thomson was a prominent member of the Glasgow Improvement Society. Thomson was also a member of the United Presbyterian Church, which, having devolved from the Church of Scotland in response to the influence that landowners had over the institution, had developed principles based on social justice. Thompson and his United Presbyterian Church were motivated to solve urban problems following the civic responsibilities of the old Scots parish church. This approach is one of the reasons why Glasgow isn't characterised by grand palaces and aristocratic homes, but by civic buildings such as churches and galleries.
We're in front of the Stuart Memorial Fountain, which is quite apart from being a magnificent fountain. It's a memorial to the former Lord Provost Robert Stewart, who spearheaded this very ambitious initiative to bring potable drinking water to the city from Loch Katrine. And it's also a memorial to the engineering achievements that were undertaken in order to bring drinking water to Glasgow. It tells you a huge amount about Kelvingrove Park, which was laid out by Glasgow Corporation. And Glasgow is one of the kind of principal cities where there are a whole series of fantastic parks here available for members of the public. And that was a very, very important part of the development of Glasgow, was this notion that it was such a built-up city and such an industrial city when it was the second city of the empire, that there was a need for amenity space, that people could actually kind of take a great big deep breath and enjoy sort of a green space. And that's what makes Glasgow such a tremendous city. It's this contrast. The west was open countryside, pretty much from Charing Cross until you reached the village of Partick, which is why it was such a desirable part of the city in which to develop. It was simply because any sort of green space in the city had already been used up for residential purposes, and it was a case of just moving further away from the industry, which was for the most part located in the north and east of the city, moving further west into the kind of clean open air. Because Glasgow is such a tremendously contoured city, there was also potential for views, which is very, very important.
In order to improve conditions, a wealth of new housing was built from the 1880s onwards. The bulk of this housing took the form of the distinctive and iconic Glasgow tenement. Glasgow Corporation, the predecessor of Glasgow City Council, studied housing in Paris and other European cities and devised a scheme that would incorporate an understanding of elevation and light in the construction of streets and homes. Tenements were not a low-quality, quick fix. They were each individually architect-designed. These buildings housed not only the poorest of Glasgow's citizens, but also the middle and upper classes. Externally, there was little difference between these egalitarian dwellings. More affluent homes were merely larger and more ornamented.
The main thing about Glasgow is its people. The immigration, which still occurs today, just makes it a really exciting crucible of ideas and of activity and all these different things that just make it really, really amazing to live in. But there's also this more silent design hands within the city. Tenements, defined city blocks that you can walk from miles out with the city centre right the way into the city, passing nothing but tenements. If you think of it like a collage of a number of different typologies of buildings that come together in order to make the city and give the city its character.
The tenement, which was this tremendous urban model, this means of housing large numbers of people, occurred across the city, and it followed something of a pattern. There was a kind of like an architectural language that was used in the construction of the tenements. So generally, I would say what unifies the city is the fact that there are so many of those still intact. And where those tenements are lowest, where they're three-storey and built in yellow sandstone, they're probably oldest. And if you were, for instance, to walk from Dumbarton Road up to Highborough Road in the West End, you would be able to see tenements that actually start off 3 stories high, built in yellow sandstone, and by the time you've reached the top of the road, the tenements have got 2 addresses because you've moved from the old Victorian tenement to the red sandstone, glorious Edwardian tenements that were in fact mansions upper close.
In terms of the civic responsibility of any architect within any city, you have to at least acknowledge your context and at least respond to it in some way. Architects knew how to turn a corner with a building, how to terminate a street, how to cap a building. All these are civic obligations of an architect. If you think of some tenements that have bay windows on them, notice how some of them will actually turn a corner. It's special for the occupants within the flat, but it's also something that's enjoyable for the passerby in the street. It gives the city its colour and its style and its gravitas.
One of the key features of development in this period was the ancient Scottish feud duty system, which required owner-occupiers to pay an annual duty to the feudal superior and comply with a number of regulations concerning the upkeep of the fabric of the buildings. It also meant that the feudal superiors, who had supervised the development of the land, would have a continued interest in keeping up standards.
Something that the Scots seem to do really well in all of their cities, that they do seem to have that sense of harmoniousness. A large part of that is down to the genius of viewing for the tenements in particular. When you look at your title deeds for your tenements, as part of that, it tells you basically what the developer could build on the site. It's very simple and straightforward. It's, it must be built in stone and lime, it must have rise to a certain number of stories, it must contain a certain number of apartments in each. You weren't allowed to raise chickens, and you definitely weren't allowed to do anything with turkey dye. But from those relatively simple couple of sides of A4s, you got a really good cityscape coming out of that. So there was a genius behind that, which I think is quite interesting.
Glasgow, outside of the central grid, is a city of integrated localities, each different, but each inescapably Glaswegian. The neighbourhood of Hindland, for example, is designed as a unified whole. The typical Hindland tenement is a 4-storey building of red sandstone, with a slate roof, canted bay windows, stained glass in the stair windows and front doors, tall chimneys and modest front gardens with ornamental railings. Decorative features include distinctive corner roofs and corner windows. Access to the flats, usually 8 to a close, is via a common entrance decorated with tiles, known in Glasgow as a wally close. Alongside tenements, there were 2 other forms of housing that combined to give each neighbourhood its own character: terraces and detached villas. These different building types exist to this day as a unified and mutually supportive tapestry because they are all constructed from comparable materials. They are built on a similar scale, with no one building dominating its neighbours, and they are set within a sympathetic landscape of trees and parks. Some of the finest examples of terraces and villas can be found along the grandest avenue in Glasgow, Great Western Road. Laid out as a toll road in 1836, Great Western Road was an alternative path into the city, circumventing the factories, shipyards and slums towards the south. But through further development, this thoroughfare became a very attractive, indeed elegant, part of the city.
Great Western Road was intended as a means of maximising the value of that estate. It ran through a landscape which was pretty grotty. It had been used for mining and quarrying and rather indifferent agriculture. It's important to bear in mind that when Great Western Road was laid out, the Great Western Road was originally envisaged as a respectable route into the city centre, so you didn't have to go through the noisome slums and see the dirty poor people. You could come in through middle-class people, and it was much nicer.
In a stretch, with some of the finest and most celebrated terraces in the city, stands perhaps the greatest example of the form, Alexander Greek Thomson's Great Western Terrace.
Great Western Terrace is perhaps the grandest terrace in Glasgow, and certainly I think Thompson's finest, really. 11 really large houses grouped together in a most unusual way, because there are 2-storey houses and 3-storey houses. But in a conventional way, I think an architect would have the 3-storey houses either in the middle or at the ends. But Thompson puts the higher ones one house in from the end. There's a very subtle arrangement of windows and voids. I mean, the windows are very plain. And normally you have, in any sort of classical portico, really, as here, you have an even number of solids and an odd number of voids. But Thompson reverses that here. It's full of extraordinary subtleties which you don't notice at first. One of Thompson's admirers was an architect called Thomas Gildard, who wrote about this: in the fenestration, the solids are the uneven number, not the voids. After having once detected this anomaly, I never saw it again except when I was looking for it. Only a genius of a high order could, with so few and seemingly so simple elements, design a building of such composed unity. The windows have no dressings, but Greek goddesses could afford to appear undressed.
As the city expanded westward, it also expanded south. New middle-class neighbourhoods were created in the great swathes of undeveloped land there, notably Pollokshields.
Pollokshields is on the south side of the city, so it's across the River Clyde from the city centre, and it spreads towards the west of the city. So the eastern half of Pollokshields is predominantly tenemental because it's relatively level land, whereas when we get into the western half of the suburb, that's where it all starts. You get drumlins and very rolling hills, and so you get lots of villas, lots of detached villas, and very spacious detached villas in that part of it. So it was known, because it was very leafy, as the lung of Glasgow. The area was built by the Maxwell family because they owned a great estate at Pollock House and Pollock Park. And they were obviously conscious that at some point Glasgow was going to encroach on them. So they wanted to control development between their estate and the city, which is why they developed Pollokshields. They were quite interested in urbanism. And so they wanted to do that because they were conscious there had been 3 great cholera epidemics in Glasgow, and a lot of people had died as a consequence of that. So they were looking very carefully at the structure of what they developed. So they imposed things like 3-story datums, very broad streets, so you could get lots of light and air to get rid of what were the miasmas of the city, which was what they thought were causing disease. And the other thing too was the leafiness of the countryside. So particularly with some of these tenements were developed, they literally were right on the edge of the countryside, and they were advertised as countryside living, even though you were living in a flat in what is now the centre of a major city. Sir John Stirling Maxwell, he's the grandson of Sir John Maxwell, who establishes the original garden suburb. He sat on the board of the Caledonian Railway Company. And so he was able to kind of dictate where the line of the Cathcart Circle would go. And he also dictated the form that it took. So he insisted on it being put into a cutting, so it was concealed. And what he did was he sold the land to the Caledonian Railway Company at agricultural prices, so very cheap. And then he realized, because on the back of that, that all the surrounding land, once the railway had gone through, would massively rise in value. And then he sold that all off at residential rates for much more money. So it was a very profitable speculation for him. But it was also very good planning as well, because it meant that the railways completely integrated into the surrounding tenement and villa context, and everything flows seamlessly. So you get pedestrian bridges and road bridges just that slide over the top of the railway line. So it's all tucked out of sight. So, and then the railway basically runs in a leafy avenue. It's all very well thought through, so it doesn't impinge on the kind of domestic comforts. Because he controlled the land, he was quite insistent on aesthetic standards. And this particularly affects the western half of the suburb. He insisted that every single house should be different. So every single house, it's very difficult to spot. There are similar designs, but they're all variations rather than being identical. And he was quite insistent on that. Whereas in the tenemental area, it seems to be much more about harmony. So you get whole blocks of tenements that are very much identical. I mean, the south side is inevitably sleepier than the city centre and the west end, which were more densely populated. But the beauty of the south side is how well it was laid out. You get a variety of very interesting suburban traits around here. So, for instance, you've got Pollokshields, which the Maxwells and the Stirling Maxwell families are sitting working away on. Then you've got things like Strathbungo, which was a speculation, but it was one that was laid out by Greek Thomson. With the way that Greek Thomson designs that, and the street section across that is incredibly handsome. There's beautifully proportioned streets and just really beautifully framed or really simply, elegantly modelled townhouses.
Well, Murray Place, which the great American historian Henry Russell Hitchcock called the finest of all Grecian terraces, is an example of how he grouped houses together as a single composition. Of course, you get terraces of houses elsewhere, in Bath, in Edinburgh, but often they're treated as if they're a big country house or a palace. Thompson's terraces aren't like that. They're his own compositions, each one different. And here in Murray Place, he had 10 houses, which he unified with this long horizontal colonnade of 52 identical square columns. And in one of his architectural lectures, he talked about the power of the horizontal element, carrying the mind away into space and into speculations upon infinity. That's what you have here. Thompson was happy to work with the very nature of Glasgow of streets. His terraces fit into streets, the urban townscape of Glasgow, of terraces of houses or of tenements. He was hugely influential. In this area, in Strathbungo, Thompson only designed Murray Place, but the surrounding tenements show his influence and how much he was admired and what he did was admired. So he was very important in Glasgow.
Glasgow is known to many as the Dear Green Place. Drawing on the example of Haussmann in Paris, Victorian planners intended that each neighbourhood would have its own public park. These parks are grand designs in their own right, meticulously landscaped with rivers, views and amenities. Some are just pocket parks, and some are much, much larger. Perhaps the greatest example of the integration of housing and parkland is the Kelvin Grove Park area, with terraces on a hill overlooking the beautifully landscaped valley of the River Kelvin.
The architect for the park area was Charles Wilson. You've got this work that's almost exclusively by a single architect, which gives it an astonishing homogeneity. And it's just the most remarkably ambitious, beautifully built and fabulously planned urban set piece. And it's deservedly internationally renowned. Wilson was very fortunate insofar as he was also involved in the design of Kelvin Grove Park. So he was able to actually look at it as being a composition set in the landscape. Wilson's office drawings have been lodged with Historic Environment Scotland in Edinburgh, and it's possible to study the development and kind of follow Charles Wilson's thought process as he struggled with kind of somehow elevating Park Terrace and somehow expressing it in a way that was satisfactory both to him and would be satisfactory to the city and would respond well to Kelvin Grove Park. I like to think that the park area represents the kind of the high point of his career, but sadly, like so many other architects of the day, it clearly was such an incredibly difficult project, being worked at such a pace and so intensively that it probably shortened his lifespan. He was president of the Glasgow Architectural Society in 1860, but had to stand down through ill health and died in 63, so we didn't live to see the park area completed. These men mostly died fairly young, or young by today's standards, but achieved such an amount. And they had the opportunity to work on almost every single building type. They built schools, churches, public buildings, tenements, townhouses, terraces. They weren't exclusively working on one building type, which is what is generally the case nowadays. So healthcare, for instance, isn't something that I would dream of being involved in. But Charles Wilson, as a relatively young architect, one of his first projects was what we know as Gartnavel Hospital, the Royal Asylum for Lunatics, just off Great Western Road. And that was a relatively young man that he was given this huge commission. It would have been unheard of for him to say, I don't think I'm up to it because I don't specialise in hospitals. They turned their hands to absolutely everything. It gave them the opportunity to each do their own bit for the improvement of the city and the betterment of the life of its citizens. So, for instance, Gartnavel was designed by Wilson in quite an innovative manner, probably inspired by trips that he'd made to England and France to study similar hospitals. And it was laid out with very, very wide corridors into which the wards opened so that the corridors could be used as day rooms. And that was really quite an innovative concept. So they were thinking all the time of how they could make life better for the people who were using the buildings. Wilson, he practised at the same time as Alexander Greek Thomson. I suspect that Wilson was very good at actually promoting the business of architecture as well as the art of architecture. And unlike Alexander Greek Thomson, Wilson was not averse to giving a client what that client wanted. So for instance, if that client had a predilection for the Scots baronial or the Gothic, then Wilson would oblige. And as a result, although he worked best in the Italianate style, he also became extremely proficient in the Scots baronial style because that was the style in which the owners of large country houses were interested. This is the Queen's Rooms, or it was originally the Queen's Rooms. It was designed and built as a suite of public halls, commissioned by a merchant called David Bell of Blackhall, and it was named in honour of Queen Victoria. It was clearly intended to be a suite of rooms for dancing, for exhibitions, for concerts, for what we now call conferences. And so there wasn't a requirement for an enormous amount of daylight, and it's on quite a restricted corner site. So what Wilson did was he just designed a very bold, decorated box, and that box is decorated with the most extraordinary sculpture scheme, and that's what makes this such a remarkable building. It's the extent of the carving, the extent of the sculpture, because what you've got on the east frontage are tributes to the arts and literature and to politics.
As the wealth of Glasgow grew, many architects chose to reflect this in their work. They were encouraged to do so by their commissioners and by the city leaders who benefited in kind from displaying their power. This largesse was reflected in the dense interior and exterior ornamentation typical of many of the buildings constructed in Glasgow between 1850 and the First World War.
Glasgow was so hugely wealthy, both in European and world terms. And the reason for that was because it was absolutely at the cutting edge of technology at that time. And the reason for that was it was a major centre for engineering, particularly shipbuilding and ship engineers. And there are a whole load of them who live in Pollokshields. What they do is that they take kind of people's previous inventions and they kind of reverse engineer them, they really advance them, they make them far more efficient. So you get things like with, say, Howden's. James Howden lived around the corner from here. He massively improved the efficiency of steam engines with a mechanical drafting system. And the consequence of that meant that you didn't need the frequency of coaling stations that the British Empire had. Ships could go much further with less coal, so you got faster ships as well. So his system was installed in liners like the Lusitania and Titanic, and that really was the basis. It was that engineering aspect and also the network that had been built up in the city of all of these different industries that helped back up the shipbuilding industry and the locomotive industry. That was the basis of Glasgow's wealth. It was engineering and technical prowess. Industrial city aspect of it is a side effect of trade, as it were. And it was what's called an entrepot as well, where it imports goods and then exports them elsewhere. So that's where you get, say, the tobacco trade from and the tobacco lords. Though it is kind of one of Glasgow's little dirty secrets that the tobacco lords got early American colonists addicted to debt. They wanted the wealth and beautiful goods from Europe, and they traded those off against their crops and against future crops. So that was how Glasgow initially made its money.
But for all the social progress that resulted from Glasgow's tobacco trade riches, there was also a moral cost. Britain and France's colonial trading depended on slavery. Jefferson Davis, former president of the American Southern Slave States, can be seen in this photo, visiting friends in Glasgow's West End, highlighting the entrenched links that tied trade, tobacco, and slavery in that era.
You know, a huge amount of what went on behind the commissioning of buildings was the display of wealth as well as the creation of pride. The Glasgow Savings Bank are a tremendous example. They essentially established themselves in the city and then made a point of purchasing as many corner sites in the city as they could in order that they could attract as many investors as possible. And what that essentially meant was they would often buy out a kind of previous purchaser of a corner site in order that they could secure endure it. And then they would commission very grand tenements, essentially, for the most part, very grand buildings on these corners in order to give investors the sense that their money was safe and being properly invested.
In the 1880s, the textile and carpet firm James Templeton and Company's proposals to build a factory on the historic Glasgow Green were refused by city leaders. In response, Templetons ordered their architect William Leaper to design a building so grand that it couldn't possibly be declined. Leaper thought that the ideal inspiration for a grand building was the Doge's Palace in Venice. With this new opulent proposal, Templeton and Leaper were successful. Their ambition was just one example of the intent Glasgow had to demonstrate its wealth in every possible building form. Just because a simple factory was functional did not mean that it had to lack grandeur. Commerce and aesthetics were bound tightly together to create a unique and lasting impression.
The great merit of a lot of Glasgow buildings is that they are stylish in a permanent way. They're not just following a fashion that was a fashion at the time. Because the design was really good design, it's proved durable. To my mind, there's a more durable aspect to a lot of Glasgow's trade and business. And people are looking to the longer term. They are conscious that they've got to keep up to date. Most of them, I think, were in it for the long haul. Particularly the shipbuilders, of course, whose capital investment was very great.
We're in the Clyde Navigation Trust building, now known as Clydeport, built for the authority that looked after all the shipping and trade on the Clyde, so of huge importance to Glasgow, given what the Clyde meant. A building begun in the 1880s, finished in the Edwardian years, and designed by a man who I regard as one of the great, possibly unsung heroes of Glasgow architecture, JJ Burnet, later Sir John Burnet. He really ought to be up there with Mackintosh and Salmon and others as one of the architects who transformed the city around the turn of the century. But whereas Mackintosh and Salmon went in for a sort of Art Nouveau, Burnet went in a different direction. He was modern, he knew about America, he had close contacts with architects in the United States, used new materials like steel frames and reinforced concrete, and was a very rational, common sense architect, but his buildings have a wonderful richness and inventiveness in classical terms. In the late 19th century, many Scots architects went to train in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. This hardly happened at all in England, but I think possibly because of the Old Alliance, architects did go to Paris, great sympathy there, and Burnet was one of the very best who went. And I think at the École des Beaux-Arts he learnt how to plan well. He's a brilliant planner of large-scale public buildings, and to use materials in a rational, sensible way, as I think one sees very much in this building. His classicism was very sort of rich and eclectic. He used elements from a variety of sources. He also built in Gothic, the chapel of the university. He wasn't doctrinaire about style at all. He just felt it's how you interpreted the style that mattered. And I think he was an architect of immense skill and sophistication. I think you can see in Glasgow, around about 1900, two schools of modernity. One was the Art Nouveau of Mackintosh and Salmon. The other was a slightly American-influenced Beaux-Arts classicism that was handling new materials like the steel frame and reinforced concrete. I think the Clyde Navigation Trust, along with City Chambers, two of the most opulent buildings in sort of late Victorian, Edwardian Glasgow. Both, of course, are very important. And here, Burnet showed how he could use the best and richest of materials. This room, this reception room, is lined with French walnut, imitation Spanish leather on the walls, and it's full of nautical references, I think rather cleverly and wittily done. The ceiling is like an old sailing ship, the interior of an old sailing ship, but what I really love are these sliding doors where you can see how they're hung from a rail with rollers, a system which you get on sheds along the Clyde. But Burnet has made them more ornamental by having the great long beam that supports the doors with its ends like the prow of a galleon. Well, Glasgow for a long time regarded itself, I think, as a progressive, forward-looking city. So architects would start experimenting with the possibilities new technologies offered. cast iron structures, huge sheets of plate glass, which they appealed to Thompson. With Salmon, there's a steel frame and the reinforced concrete as well. And so Burnet was looking to see what he could do with new materials. And he was very much aware of what was going on in the United States with the development of the skyscraper. You didn't get skyscrapers in Glasgow, but he knew about those high-rise buildings with their steel frames. And so he reinterpreted those sources on a smaller scale here in Glasgow.
So JJ Burnet was one of the first distinguished Scots architects to be trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Burnet developed strong links with modern American architecture and was an inventive classicist. He and his late Victorian and Edwardian contemporaries took influences from Glasgow's trading partners, America and France, combining them with techniques perfected in the Clyde shipyards. This innovative approach, unifying the local and the global, became the defining characteristic of what came to be known as the Glasgow Style. The Glasgow Style was an aesthetic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that drew upon many different cultural inspirations, both from Scotland's past and the wider world, to create new, distinctive forms in architecture and art, with Burnet being one of the earliest instigators.
So there is this link between the shipbuilding and the architecture in the city, and you get that emerging in particular in the Glasgow Style, that the Glasgow Style is a hybrid. And so it's in part about nationalism because you get this rebirth of interest in Scottish baronialism, but it's also heavily influenced with international connections as well. So for instance, because of Glasgow's great trade links, it was one of the first cities to have people who went out to Japan when Japan reopened for trade and reopened to the West again. So that is partially where the Glasgow Style comes from, partially where you get these kind of great stained glass pieces in Glasgow, because they are looking at how the Japanese draw and the Japanese illustrations, and that very much informs the Glasgow Style, which is why you get this curious hybrid in things like the Glasgow School of Art, where you have this very Scottish exterior to the building, particularly from the south elevation of the building, which is just like one huge Scottish castle. And then inside, when you get to the library, it's much more like a Japanese interior. But at the same time, one of the kind of the geniuses of the Glasgow Style was that link with the shipyards in terms of the fastness of getting something done. That's the kind of influences, and that's where the kind of the wealth, the ability to trade, the speed with which you trade, and those connections, the international connections, which all come together in what was a world city. That's why the Glasgow Style happens here.
Well, we're in St Vincent Street, and this extraordinary building behind me is the Hat Rack, as it's known, because of course it has a spiky roof, and you can imagine putting giant hats on top of it. It's one of the most remarkable Art Nouveau buildings in Glasgow. I mean, far too often people just think in terms of Mackintosh, but Mackintosh was not alone. Glasgow around about 1900 was astonishingly creative in experimenting in architecture, and as well as Mackintosh, there was his friend James Salmon, Jr., who did one of the first reinforced concrete buildings in Glasgow, Lion Chambers. And this, which is a steel frame building with this extraordinary delicate Art Nouveau filigree front, which is like nothing quite else, I think, in the city, only one of the most remarkable buildings in Britain.
The Glasgow boys and girls were painters who also embraced and came to epitomise this style. But it was the MacDonald sisters, Margaret and Frances, and their marriages that brought together the four ambitious artists who were to be the true innovators of the time. Known as the Four, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Herbert McNair, and the MacDonald sisters exhibited their art around the world. With the health and social problems that spurred Thompson into action having improved, Mackintosh was free to experiment. Mackintosh took a holistic approach to design similar to Thompson's, applying fundamental principles and inspirations from the overall plan right down to the tiniest details of exterior decorations and furnishings. Mackintosh was supported as a young architect by the scholarship fund set up in Thompson's honour. He may even have been inspired by Thompson's Haldane lectures, where Thompson urged creators to continually pour ideas into a forge and fuse new ones, so as not to be held back by outdated norms. The MacDonald sisters drew from a wide range of inspirations, including Celtic imagery and the works of William Blake. Mackintosh's fascination with Japan, fueled by mutual trading links, brought in the elongation of form and the minimal characteristics that are the distinguishing features of his work.
I would say that Mackintosh is certainly, he's almost a hallmark of Glasgow today. You can go to other places, you can see across the world typefaces of fonts and other things from Mackintosh, like the vocabulary of Mackintosh's design, his art, his work, his architecture, that's now been applied to many other things. At the time that he was practicing, he was looking north. He was looking into the vernacular and the syntax of his own country and transforming that into something completely new. So he was taking quite unusual influences at the time and transforming them into his own language and being absolutely pioneering in that endeavour. And when you look at this house, it's one of the first examples of his work where he's using rough cast or harling as a consistent finish around the exterior of the house in order to unify all the elements into a cohesive whole. That, I think, was a game changer for him. It was quite odd at the time as well. It's at a time when decoration and detail were seen as being what you would want to aspire to if you were of any sort of high class in society. Whereas Mackintosh was taking quite ordinary, in fact very ordinary, inspirations from traditional ways of making buildings and transforming them into a really modern and contemporary architecture. You must remember, at that time it was an industrial city. Mackintosh's work, the kind of gestation of what became his architecture, all came from almost a reaction from the kind of the darkness and the sootiness of the city, but even in terms of the accepted norms of decoration and architecture at the time, when things were quite closed in and masculine and dark and sometimes very highly overwrought at times. There's kind of this movement of saying, taking from nature, drawing from nature and abstracting nature and going to a world where it's almost a more egalitarian society, a more free society. And it's quite staggering to think that in Mackintosh's work, he only really has an architectural career of around about 10 to 12 years. And when you look at the art school as well, you look at that north facade, the mastery of that north facade, the balanced asymmetry. So you have 4 main windows on one side, 3 on the other. You look at the streetscape, so the railings towards the street is absolutely symmetrical. The door is smack bang right in the middle of the facade, and the whole thing is hung and composed in such an amazing manner that it's almost defies belief. If you can imagine going along Pollokshields Street on a tram or on a high-top bus when you're elevated from the street as well, and seeing this huge castle-like structure, 7 floors or thereabouts, there right above you on this hill up above the city. It must have been an absolutely overwhelming shock for the people of Glasgow at the time. I mean, they've seen nothing like it. They've seen nothing like it since, really. There's a brilliant German word, Gesamtkunstwerk, which means is probably one of the only German words I know, but it means the complete work of art. It wasn't enough to just have Mackintosh, another one of his great phrases, to do a mere envelope without contents, is that he would need to design the complete and utter work of the whole thing. I think that's actually what adds to the majesty of the kind of composition of the whole, is the fact that he has the control over every single aspect of the house or the building or the school or any of these different things.
I think it's an embodiment of actually how Glasgow's working as a city in itself, because it's quite interesting to note that there are no real actual monuments in a sense, nothing that's sort of revered as being too precious to use or too precious to interact with. That is a characteristic of Glasgow. When we sort of think of Glasgow, we know it's not a capital city. Perhaps if Glasgow was a capital city, it would have that kind of sort of status of, you know, let's protect a certain thing or cover it in plastic and try not to use it. Whereas here, no, we're still thriving in it, we're still living in it, we're still living amongst it. And that's what adds to the appeal of these buildings and places and spaces within the city itself. It's what gives Glasgow, I think, its character and its edge.
I think, yes, Glasgow is both a very hard-nosed city, straightforward buildings, and yet there's joy in them, there's pleasure in them. Architects like Thompson in the mid-century and Burnet and Mackintosh later in the century make something much more out of the utilitarian, the joy of ornament and decoration. So Glasgow is not just a utilitarian, commercial, money-making city. There's much more. And after all, in the end, architecture, the most public of arts, is for public benefit.
What's nice about Glasgow, we're back to niceness again, is in the city centre that you're never aware of individual buildings unless you want to be aware of them. If you start looking at them as individual buildings, then you will see great things in them. And I've been looking at Glasgow streets for 70 odd years now.
I think because in Glasgow we don't ever have an atmosphere or feeling of anything being too precious or too sacred or too sacrosanct for everyday people to interact with. To use the great architect's phrase, Rebeccan, that nothing is too good for ordinary people. And here in Glasgow is very much a feeling of that. I think it's what gives the people and the buildings and the streetscapes and the squares and the parks their characteristic, their Glasgow charm. But it's also that feeling that typifies everything here.
I think it really goes back to the kind of city it fundamentally is. Glasgow never had an aristocracy. There were landowners around the edge, and some of the merchants bought land and so on. But it wasn't dominated by a landowner or landowners. And I think that's very, very healthy. And one of the weaknesses of Edinburgh, to my mind, as a city, was it had too much involvement by the state, in the sense of monarchy, and also by all the hangers-on that any monarchy tends to attract. And they are not the kind of people who are interested in a place because they don't have a place. The Duke of wherever, his interests are in his estate. They're not interested, it's not in Edinburgh. He may be in Edinburgh because that's where the politics are happening. But his real roots, his real gut feeling will be with wherever his estates are. Glasgow's not like that. In Glasgow, the people who are managing the city, who are involved in its affairs, were people whose interests were in the place.
Glasgow, as it stands today, is still very much the city that was developed in the Victorian and Edwardian ages to provide a good life for all of its residents, an aspiration that motivated both the civic authorities and private individuals. Despite enormous upheaval in the 20th century, Glasgow remains a spectacular yet ultimately functional place, its founding principles running through every stone, road and tree. It is a city that is not only a testimony to life as it is lived, but also a diverse and complex work of art.
Glasgow is a hotbed for me. Glasgow is the place where all ideas and all things are met with, normally with enthusiasm and sometimes scepticism, but that's healthy.
I had the pleasure and privilege of living in Glasgow for a decade or so, in a Thompson building, of course, with its wonderful rooms. But the great thing about Glasgow was it is a unique city, so urban and yet also so green, like London in a way, full of open spaces, but also densely built up with a character of its own. I like living in cities, and if you can't live in London or Glasgow, nowhere else to live really. Wouldn't want to live in the country.
The architectural critic Ian Nairn, so he had this fantastic quote about Glasgow where he said that Glasgow is basically a Beethoven symphony in stone, but it kept going for 2 centuries. And he just thought it was the most powerful place in terms of urbanism and classical architecture, and it all integrates together really, really well into one seamless whole. And see, when you're walking through Glasgow, you really get that kind of feel for it. It is just the most superb cityscape setting.
The people identify with Glasgow. There is this sense of urban place that I think is very powerful. And I think people like a place they feel that they're a part of, that belongs to them. I can remember a few months ago, I was at an event in the Trades Hall in Glasford Street. Lovely, lovely building. And I came out of that building and I walked down to the Tron Gate to get a bus. And I sat in the bus shelter in the Tron Gate, and into my mind came that wonderful song, Glasgow Belongs to Me. And I felt, this is my Glasgow. I'm only a common old working man, as anyone here can see, but when I get a couple of drinks on a Saturday, Glasgow belongs to me.